Well, hey everybody, welcome back to the studio slash the kids' bunk room with the plastic behind us, and actually have a microphone set up today to try and do a little better audio. Thrilled to have you here and to have our guest Steve Cockram that I'm going to introduce in just a second. I want to highlight the fact that we have decided, pivot is the word of the month, right? And sometime back when all of the COVID things started, we pivoted and we created resources at churchcovid19.com. And you'll see that if you go there and you need help figuring out how to deal with this. But it felt to me, and I want to ask you this in a minute, Steve, it felt to me, and maybe I've just got the Easter bounce in my step, but something has shifted in people's minds and hearts now. You can hear it in the news, where now it's no longer how do we deal with COVID-19, not that it's something small, but now it's like, how do we reopen? Like, how do we get going again? And if you'll go to reopeningthechurch.com, you'll see a whole lot of resources, including this will be housed there, because we think that the reopening and focusing on how that's going to happen might be just as important as the quick pivots that happened to deal with the crisis itself. So today we're going to focus. This podcast was scheduled 100 years ago and has been punted a million times because of this COVID crisis. And Steve's been very gracious to allow us to reschedule and reschedule. But in God's timing, it's actually perfect. Because Steve has a book that he's written, 5 Leadership Voices. I'm going to get the title wrong. The 5 Leadership Voices, How to Communicate Effectively with Everyone You Lead. And it's a book you wrote a while ago, but man, it seems to be something for right here and right now. So I want to dive into all that. But Steve, I want you to introduce yourself to our audience and let us know a little of your story and where you're doing and about your recent golf victories. I'd love to hear that.
Thank you, William. Well, it's lovely to be with you. I appreciate the invitation. And I think, gosh, what do you need to know about me? Well, I was 50 in February, so that means I'm officially old now. I'm married.
No. You're in the power decade.
There you go, the power decade. I'll use that well. Americans are so much better at marketing than us Brits. I live just outside London in a place called Gerrards Cross. I've been married to Helen for 28 years. I've been happily married for all of them. Helen for roughly about the last 12, I think she tells me. We have 3 girls. Izzy, he will be 20 this week. Megan, who's 16, and Charlotte, who is 8. And we have a little puppy called Jemima, who's about 1 year old and loves her daddy. And apparently I love her more than I love the other children. So I know you have 7, William, so I feel very inadequate by comparison with your reproductive skills. But no, that's where I am. I used to be an athlete, but that body has decayed. So I love my golf. It's about the only sport I can compete with and still enjoy that. And you can see a cup behind me. I'm currently the club match play champion. So there we go. That's my claim to fame. And for anyone who's been on Facebook, the girls were so sad for me that the golf course was shut. They built me a little 4-hole mini golf course in the back garden and filmed it where I happened to have a hole in one. So on Facebook, they then put overlay from it from the Masters about a shot for the ages and everything else like that. So, you know, there's been all kinds of creativity, William, in the backyard with everybody in lockdown. So, you know, that's, I've done everything that no one would ever have a resume like mine. I've been a school teacher, I've been a pastor, a nightclub owner, a consultant, a performance coach, and I've led a number of nonprofits and latterly basically started a business called Giant with Jeremy Kubicek, and we're 7 years old now. So I'm much better at coaching other people than I am being basically the person who leads organizations once they're beyond startup. I'm very entrepreneurial, very charismatic in selling things. But when it comes to the consistency and metronomic disciplines of leading organizations into the second phase, I know myself well enough to know that there are people who are far more gifted at that. And even when I think I'm being consistent, apparently I'm not. So there we go. That's a little pick the bones out of that, William, whatever you want.
Well, I think a lot of our friends who are listening who are involved in their church or lead their church would know the word giant. I mean, that's been a pretty big player in the church world. And I think if you looked at your site, just Google Steve Cockram and you'll find it. You'll see that he has spoken to a lot of people and really has had that visionary look forward. What are the next things on the horizon, like an entrepreneur? And if you're like me as an entrepreneur, isn't it wonderful to just sit inside for 4 weeks? Not my strength zone, but anyway, the ability to see forward. I didn't even know we were going to talk about this, but you've been thinking and researching and writing about what leaders are going to have to be in the future, and now the future got here faster than we thought. I think that's a safe way to say it,
No,
right? But
no,
walk me through some of that.
that's absolutely true. I think when Jeremy and I started the new business, we basically said, and I think we did something really well. We realized the world had changed and that we were moving in a way that the West has only moved roughly every 250 years. There's a technological breakthrough that changes the world of work, and it changes the world of work and therefore changes the skills of leadership. So whether you go back to, the printing press and Johann Gutenberg in 1450, or, the rotary steam engine with James Watt in about 1740, these things precipitated huge changes in culture. So the Reformation, the printing of books and the dissemination of information was a massive driver of change. And obviously the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of our world. And the belief is that basically when Tim Berners-Lee typed those immortal letters and a dot, www dot, he basically began a new era for the West, where actually we move from the late industrial age to the digital age. And that's what we've spent the last 6 years really trying to work out. What does it mean to retool leaders for the world that's coming rather than the world that has been? And if you were born after 1982, you've absolutely no idea what we're talking about. If you were born before that, you happen to be in that annoying place where all of the skills we learned when we first started our careers are less and less relevant to the world that we're now moving into.
Well,
And
I'll interrupt you, Steve. One of my wife is so good at, she's made a list of things we've meant to get to forever, but haven't had the time. And now we have the time. So we're spending time. And one of those projects that the kids just cannot figure out is taking all of my old sermons, which are on these things called VHS cassettes, and translating them into a machine into the cloud. And they're like, so you had a machine and you had to watch and you go rent it somewhere? And so some people listening today, they're going to think it's two dinosaurs talking about the ice age coming. But I'd love to hear some of those key insights. It's really what the Five Voices is about. Like, you've seen this coming for a while, but now crisis is an accelerator, right? So,
absolutely.
So where I'd like to sit is to hear about those five voices, and then what changes that we're making now with COVID will become permanent changes and what will not. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So what's interesting for your audience is that basically, if you think of the diffusion of innovation and ideas, there are the early adopters, there's the early majority, late majority, and laggards. The reality is what's happened with COVID-19 has basically accelerated those who would naturally be in the late majority. So education, church, government, they're usually the ones by nature that are more conservative with change because they're protecting either children or they're protecting a deposit, which is, in the church's case, timeless truth. So they usually like to see it worked out first before they really commit to the new future. Well, of course, every church I know and every school I know has had to accelerate from their present into the digital future in roughly 2.5 weeks. So the COVID-19, whatever it does, will actually have changed the world because we will never go back to purely what we had before. So churches will actually have to have a high tech and a high touch strategy. So will schools, so will government, because in the end, now the genie is out of the bottle, we're not going back. So that world should now be incredibly relevant. So when I describe these 5 massive changes that leaders are adjusting to, I suspect that your audience of people will be much more familiar with it right now than they were even 4 weeks ago. So the first one is this, is that the industrial world, you basically had very, very compartmentalized schedules. So there was a clear delineation between work, rest, play, vacation, and everyone knew when family time was. In the digital world, you are now living in a 365, 24/7 world, where if you try and live an industrial day, your classic 9 till 6, whatever it is, and then go home and try and do a digital day as well, because somebody's been wanting to do a call or emails or all these things or a phone conference, you will burn out very quickly. So the first challenge for leaders is, how do I stay physically, emotionally, and spiritually healthy in a world that no longer turns off?
And
So
what's the answer to that?
Well, we wrote a book called 5 Gears for that one. You'll be delighted to hear, because we're saying we can't give you more time. Nobody has more time than anyone else, but you have to put in some of the transitions and the boundaries that allows you to move from the different activities. So what we would call first gear, so personal recharge and retreat. If you don't schedule these, they will overwhelm in a world where nothing changes. It's not like the weekend now is nobody works. It's not like you go on vacation and they can't get hold of you. You'll probably remember, William, those early sort of mobile phones that came with cases and we used to carry, thinking we were incredibly sophisticated executives. But of course, the moment we flew anywhere, they didn't work anyway. Now you watch people trying to find a way. How do I separate work? How do I do relationships well? How do I truly be present with my family? So one of the problems of where we are at the moment is, locked away at home, you'd think you'd have a lot more time for depth relationship with the family. If you don't schedule it and separate work from that process, you end up basically multitasking all day and all night, and you can be physically present but emotionally and intellectually absent, and everyone knows it.
Well, you probably preached this in your time as a pastor, but I used to get asked all the time, why are there all these rules? Where are the commandments? I want to have freedom. This is the teenage conversation about discipleship, right? And I would always say the freedom is in the discipline.
Yeah.
And that's all theoretical. Like, okay, if you follow the disciplines of good behavior, then you're free. If you follow the discipline of physical exercise, you're free to have more life on the back end of your years, all those things. And that was all real theoretical and theological. Now it's real. If you what is keeping our house of 7 functional right now is, Steve, we function a little bit like a military base. I mean, there's a wake up call, there's a get your stuff done, there's a set time when the kitchen opens for lunch and when it closes, because we're not going to keep it open all day. But it forces probably a higher level of routine for us, even down to physical exercise, than I would have if I were flying all over the country and seeing churches and running around, and then I'd get home for the weekend and it's a big old weekend. And so I couldn't agree with you more. But how do you see that as the church and schools and businesses reopen? How do you see the work schedule and the will things be scheduled for us again, or will this discipline need to continue and accelerate?
I think that'll be a really good question for people to ask. All I'll say is that the digital world is not going backwards. So in the end, the people that you are seeking to serve are living more and more into a digital reality where actually remote working will become norm for a lot more people than it was before COVID-19, mainly because a lot of businesses are going to go, why am I paying a huge slug of money for a property where actually we were just as productive? I think what will happen is that basically we will become more comfortable in the digital world, but actually the high touch moments will become much more valuable, and they will become something we value and cherish more. So it's like most things, is if you eat the same thing and just keep eating it, eventually you get, it loses its novelty. So I think one of the things you'll see is actually a desire for relational connectivity.
Yes.
But I think the question is, for most churches, what does that look like? And the model that most churches have been using is really the one from Victorian England. So really in the Industrial Revolution, which is where the Sunday sermon was the only entertainment in town. To go and hear one of the great orators preach for an hour was the equivalent of Netflix, going to the movies, pretty much every distraction on your iPhone you have. That was the only thing you had. And the reality is the new world will actually, I think, place a greater premium on the relational interaction than it will necessarily around actually the learning experience in the new world. So, one of
Yes.
the third challenge, and this is, I'll go to the third one, not the second one, is the new world, the digital world learns and communicates completely differently to the late industrial world. So the late industrial world is word-based, it's oratory, it's memorization, and it's books. The new world is visual, it's interactive, and demands immediate application. So the concentration span of the average child or the average person sitting listening to even a great preacher like you, William, is now less than 5 minutes. It's not that they don't want to listen, but the whole world of the way they learn is changing. And so therefore, if you don't give them an opportunity to see what you're talking about, I will model this for you now by sharing my screen so that people can see what I was talking about, that actually communication in the new world is visual, it's interactive with immediate application. So in the end, you're going to have to break. If you're going to be a great communicator in the new world, firstly, don't send long emails because nobody reads them. But when you're in a public arena communicating or in a classroom, recognize that your people will need to engage with the message you share as you're sharing it. So don't be surprised if we end up with an input and then an ability for people to process and go, so what do you think this is saying? Why don't you just turn to the person around you? Why don't you in a Zoom jump on a group? Because in the end, sitting and listening now is a law of diminishing returns.
Well, I
You remember what...
couldn't agree with you more. I want to push back a little bit. We've been thinking like, okay, so we help churches find their pastor, right? Or we help schools find their head of school, or nonprofits, or even Christian for-profits. But man, the educational world is going to have a different kind of head of school. The pastorate is going to be different. And we've seen this coming. So we've been preparing for how do we interview around this? People say, I was on an interview before Easter and somebody said, are you actually going to watch more than one Easter service? And I just laughed and I said, that's like asking a football coach if he's going to watch more than one team's film. I mean, I've been doing this for years, but the late adopters are just now realizing there's a Netflix library of the best preaching in the history of the planet right now.
Yeah.
So for us, we're seeing two things happen. One, I have a great sermon, so come to my church is out the window. That's over.
Yep.
However, the pastor who can come in and show relational care and highly contextualized sermons will be a brand new commodity.
Yes.
Like today in our community, this is happening. Here's what God says about what's happening in our micro community, where you're not going to find that from as good as Steve Furtick is. He can't preach to North Dakota as well as he can. So we feel like it's going to, there's always going to be a part of the human soul that is asking the question, could somebody please tell me a really good story? Yes. Like that's not going to go away, but the nature of it is going to shift markedly, and what kind of pastor is going to work for a church is going to change. We've been watching this and interviewing for it, and I think you're right. It's going to accelerate very, very quickly.
It requires real humility, because in the end, most pastors, the primary currency has been the Sunday sermon.
Yes.
And if you think about it, they've spent many, many hours in the average week preparing to deliver that. And we're now in a competitive world where there are effectively franchises. It comes to the second one, William, which is the new world. Leaders are having to learn to lead through influence more than positional power. So the agile world is flattening structures, and the collapse of trusted institutions means the fact that you are a policeman or a bank manager or a pastor or whatever it is. In the old days, it came with a status, because we were used to, in the industrial world, quite a hierarchical structure. So you did your time, you got promoted, you worked your way up, you did the hard yards of career, and then maybe you might get a chance to have a contribution later on. Well, the new world and the new generation coming through are literally saying, if you're having to use positional power to force your opinion, you're already undermining your influence.
That's good.
So for pastors who've been used, I think, and at times CEOs going, hey, I'm the CEO, you do it my way, or I'm the senior pastor, I've got a hotline to God, so therefore it must be right. Fundamentally, the ability to create an environment where you lead through influence, and influence is earned by who you are as much as what you do. And so therefore there's a greater desire for that integrated life, that actually your life at home with your family and spouse and kids is as much as powerful as the sermon that you will preach on Sunday. So one of my mentors once said to me, he said, Steve, he said, you're a very gifted communicator, but here's what I want you to know. Your marriage is your first sermon. Your kids are your second sermon. If they're aligned, then I'll be interested to hear what you've got to say next. And I know it always struck with me because it was a really big challenge. And I think a lot of people at times, they get lost in the position and assume that that brings the authority. The new world is forcing people to be leaders people want to follow,
Yes,
not have to follow.
and
The skill sets are very, very different.
It feels a little bit from the church world, okay, different for school and businesses, but in the church world, it feels like a return to an old world that people before 1982 would remember. And here's where I see this. I had a friend who went to a church in a town, and the pastor was a nice enough man, but his preaching, I'd really rather somebody just read the book of Leviticus to me than listen to, it was just so bad. And you couldn't tell him because he was such a nice guy. And so I asked my friend, and this was before I was in ministry, I was like, why do you go to church? What is the point when the sermon's the main thing? He said, oh, Joe can't preach himself out of a wet paper bag. But he was there when mom died. He was there when my kid was born. He's been there for us. And he has earned the right for me to sit here and listen to him. Now, I don't know that it'll be quite that stark in the past, but I do think the relational skill, like if you think of Jesus as prophet, priest, and king, the priestly gift of caring for people will be the new currency for people wanting to hear what you have to say.
And I couldn't agree more. And aligned to influence is really the industrial world celebrated the talented individual. The digital world celebrates the agile collaborative team.
Oh, that's
good. Because the
world
is...
Say that again. That's
I'll put it on the screen for you. There you go. It's almost like so the new world basically will celebrate the agile collaborative team more than the talented competitive individual.
So good.
Because if you think about it, the world that we live in now is so complex. No one individual can actually be the answer to all the challenges of the digital world. So if you think you know a lot of information, Google, Siri, Wikipedia knows a lot more than you do. And so therefore, the evolution of team as the primary unit of performance is a massive challenge to where we've had the superstar CEO, the superstar senior pastor, all those things. Because actually sometimes, in my consulting and coaching, some of the people who are the most celebrated in terms of the gift of their public ministry are horrendous when it comes to truly empowering and liberating the people around them.
I've seen it at our house in the last 4 weeks. So we try we try and set aside time to play family board games or, all the things that you ought to be doing. And it's interesting that none of my children have any interest in the board games I was interested in growing up. Trivial Pursuit, who cares about that? Just Google it, But Clue or Settlers of Catan or Risk, where you're interacting and you're showing intuitive agility and ability to move. The idea that you're going to have more data, it's passé.
But so when we talked about voices, if you think about it, we wrote the voices as a way of saying, how do you create team environments where everybody gets to bring their best to the table? So Google saved us a fortune by doing an awful lot of research to look at what were the common characteristics of the highest performing teams. And they found there were two. They nearly gave up. It took them 2 years. We worked with Google as a client, and it's been fascinating how analytical they are in what they do. But they found the two common things with this is that there was psychological safety in the team. Everybody could challenge any opinion on the table, including the leaders, without fear that it would detrimentally affect their future career prospects. So everybody believed that there was a level playing field, that your position was not what you brought to the table, even if you were the team leader. You brought influence to the table and every voice was heard. And the
So,
second
so
one,
the so the two most important things were title and number of degrees of education, right?
that's exactly right. Well, that would be in the industrial world because credentialing was everything. You know, you'd memorize enough information. So you think about that. So psychological safety, everybody could challenge any opinion. The
Wow.
second was in the average team across the average year, each person spoke roughly equal amounts of time.
Wow.
And now that is a salutary challenge to me. I think the first one I worked pretty hard at, but actually going, do you know, I'm sure I speak a lot more than some of the people in the team. So Voices was created really to find a way that the average person in the average team on the average day felt heard, valued, and appreciated. Because 82% of people, and that's not a made up statistic, and I can show you why if you later, 82% of people, William, in the average team, in the average organization, on the average day, regardless of sector, actually don't believe they're truly heard, valued, or appreciated. And because of that, the performance of how the average team performs versus their true potential has been on average 60%. So we've
Wow.
collected enough data for long enough to be able to know in the new world, whatever KPI you measure. So it doesn't matter, you know, do you measure attendance on Sunday? Do you measure giving? Do you measure, you know, revenue, EBITDA, whatever it is, we found that there is a direct correlation of one, i.e. absolute. Wherever a team is actually improving its communication, its relational trust, its ability to align around execute, you will find that if that is going up, every KPI moves with it. So this, even Google spent a year analyzing this, and they came back to us and said, it's true. Every time the team performance improves on the Team 360, it correlates with everything we measure. Now that's a real challenge for most churches. I go, you'd be amazed how many decisions are made by one person.
Yes. Yes. And that will change. And I would imagine, I wonder, did you do any research that would show a correlation between those same dynamics and staff retention?
Well, there's enough, you know, there's enough basically people who do this as a living. What they show is people leave bosses more than they leave jobs.
Yes.
So the reality is, particularly the millennial generation that's coming through, let alone Gen Z. So this is where our generation has a choice. We can either get very frustrated that why won't they do what I used to do? Why is it they want to have their opinion on the table immediately? Why do they want influence? You either say, I actually understand the new world and my job is more to be a coach than a boss.
Yes.
And to create environments where actually I develop them, and particularly resilience for that generation, because they want to work for a cause they believe in that's going to make a difference in the world, and they want to work for somebody who is a person of integrity first and is committed to helping them be the best they can be. Then what often appears, we found, is the generation which often appears the most flaky and disloyal. Why would we invest in them? They're gone in 3 years. Actually turns out to be some of the most loyal and most committed people.
Couldn't
But in
agree
the
with you more.
end, you have to recognize that if you're the leader, you define the culture. And if people are leaving, it's probably you looking in the mirror rather than blaming the generation that are younger than you. If you can harness their digital native expertise, I don't know whether Harry Potter has made it across the pond, but I would say that basically the best I will ever be is a mudblood. I'm never going to be a pureblood because I was born before 1982. But you know that the digital natives who are brilliant are crying out for people of our generation who will be mentors,
Yes.
coaches, disciplers. They're actually welcoming it in a way that perhaps my generation was a bit more cynical
Oh,
and didn't.
couldn't agree more. So I'll go back across the pond culturally, whether Star Wars and the whole saga has made it over there, but so 70% of our office or so is either millennial, Gen Z, and I'm not old enough to be their dad, but I'm not young enough to be their buddy. So I have to kind of figure out this world, and I'm still learning it. But it was interesting to me. I polled them some time back when one of the new Star Wars was coming out. What's everybody's favorite character? All the millennials, every one of them said, "Oh, Yoda." I thought that's more than a
Interesting.
coincidence. There's
Yeah.
a dynamic there. There is
Yeah.
a longing for, and if you think about, not to play this out too far, but Yoda asks way more questions than gives directives. So I think what I'm having to learn in my leadership, and I think this is going to last past COVID-19, is the leaders that will excel will allow those voices to the table and will lead with questions more than directives, which frankly, if you read the scriptures, Jesus gave a lot more questions than people realize.
Oh my word. So the other thing is time. I mean, so for me, Jesus had his 3, 12, 72 and crowds. And the thing about the millennial, I've got, the three I'm apprenticing at the moment, they want to ask so many more questions than I did when I was that age. And they assume that they have complete access. So this flattening of structures, they'll think nothing of writing to the CEO an email and thinking they're going to get an answer, because the influence and this flattening of structures and the team and teams of teams is one of those things that I think will challenge education. Because I was a teacher for years. Nobody came to my classroom. I was the master of all I surveyed, for good or ill. That learning how to be team, learning how to leverage technology. But here's the skill: leaders who can build collaborative teams that celebrate diversity and difference and create environments where everyone gets to bring their best will never be out of work in the new world. You don't have to be, to go back to your analogy of the pastor, you don't have to be the celebrity rock star who's great at everything. What you need to be is the ability to build the team that actually has a combination of superpowers, because none of us get everything. And anyone who believes they can do everything is usually heading for burnout, because the new world is moving so fast. It's 365, 24/7. And if you are a control freak that for years has controlled your world, the new world is only getting faster and it will spin you out eventually. So COVID has basically provided enforced rest, abiding. I would say that basically, there's an opportunity to learn and grow in this moment that most activists never have, but if you don't use it, you'll go back into the old world. So team, I would say, and that's why Five Voices was written, because you had to create a vocabulary and language that everyone could use, William, without an expert being in the room.
So okay, this is interesting. You got to create a language without an expert being in the room. You're using the word room. We're talking about teams. We're talking about collaboration. And earlier you said, and remote work's going to become the new norm. How does that all fit together? Yes, I'm more digitally comfortable talking to you than I was, but I still want to be around people, and it doesn't have to be 9 to 5, but I want to have blocks where I'm actually next to people, whether they're in a mask or not will be different. But am I just a dinosaur, or do you see the need for gathering together for both work and for church services just becoming a thing of the past?
No, of course. Human beings are wired for relationship. A friend of mine who's a psychologist said, Steve, you know why you get so tired doing Zoom meetings all day? I'm saying no, but I'm looking forward to finding out. He said, there is actually a human longing for physical interaction that is hardwired into the DNA. So when I see you or when I see people, there's a part of me which I'm unaware of, which would much rather be with you and to touch you. So there is a human longing. So if you think about it, most of us who use the digital world, actually what I found was I mixed, either I would go and see people or they would come to me. So my diet of the day was a mix of digital, but there was always some touch in it because I needed the mix of those things. So when I say remote teams, I think we found that basically 6 years ago, we tried it with a client, it didn't work. FaceTime without FaceTime doesn't work. That was the axiom we came up with.
That's a tweet right there. FaceTime without FaceTime
doesn't work. So if I actually meet with you face to face and we have some connection, then our relationship can be sustained using digital for a period of time and nothing changes. But it's not possible, we found, to build that relationship by starting in the digital world.
That's interesting.
There's something about human interaction that actually means, and we found that we're working with organizations where you're leading a team now where actually you've never met them physically, or you come together to bid on a project from around the world with a company. You may only see them actually face to face a couple times a year. Our rule of thumb is this, is that basically you need physical interaction a minimum of every 6 months to sustain and grow the depth of relationship and trust. And the optimum in our experience has been, if you get a choice, probably every quarter, but that's not just for a meeting. So when Giant meet, we meet for 3 or 4 days or a week, and we celebrate that because we really look forward to it. Now, here's the thing. In the high touch environments of schools, churches, offices, of course we're going to go back to a level of interaction. But living where I do, there's an awful lot of people who've been commuting into London every day for the last 20 years of their life, wasting basically an hour and a half each way on the train and wondering, have I been less productive by only not going in? Maybe what we end up with is we end up going, maybe we'll go in a couple of days a week, or maybe we'll have core time. So that's the bit for me where I think we will end up with the best of both worlds. My prayer is that church leaders don't go back to the Victorian model of just assuming that the diet is, well, we're going to gather and we're going to have face-to-face on a Sunday for 45 minutes, whatever it is.
Well, and I think this kind of piggybacks on what you were saying earlier about data transfer and the sermon being the centerpiece. I think the nature of So the nature of the successful, if that's a word you can use with pastors, will be very different, because they'll be the people who, I've had the chance to meet a lot of leaders. I've an amazing life that I couldn't have ever been the architect of. And the strongest leaders, like presidents of the United States or heads of state, it's amazing to me how when I'm with them for 30 minutes in a room, they make me feel like I'm the only person in the room. Mm-hmm. And I think that skill, so that there's an ability to maximize that incarnational moment to sort of create enough deposits to carry through the 6 months where you don't see each other. I think that's going to be a skill that people are going to look for, and that we're just going to have to learn. That's when I'm probably going to have to learn to just put my phone away when it's time for a face-to-face meeting, so I'm not doing the multitasking. But I'm just trying to envision, what are we going to have to learn as leaders? What are people going to have to find? Because I'm with you. I don't think the face-to-face goes away. I've said it this way. You said FaceTime without FaceTime doesn't work. I've said, if being with us could be done virtually, then Jesus would have Skyped it in.
Yes. I mean, if you think about how he did life, the minimum unit of team for Jesus was 2. He sent them out 2 by 2 as the 12. He sent them out 2 by 2 as the 72. He sent 2 to get a donkey, for goodness sake. So there is no such thing as, individual teams. Yet we seem in our individualistic culture to celebrate the individual. And I hope that one of the evolutions to the digital world will be a recognition that a team is as flat as possible in its hierarchy, that actually understands and celebrates what each person brings, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, experience, that actually there is something profound about that truth. So, one of the things I'd love to see is, how do teams prepare learning and communication? Because in the end, it takes the pressure off one person to be the fount of all wisdom constantly, week in, week out, which is attritional for people. But I do think there's an opportunity, because in the end, we're going to have to learn how to do this, because people now can compare your gift with someone else's gift. Well,
and I think the gift, I love this Victorian metaphor that you've used, because I think the gift, whether it's my friend who sat through the boring preaching because the relationship carried the day, if you think back to when people went to church after World War II, which, by the way, I think we're headed toward that again. I think there is a pent-up, people talk about a pent-up economic energy. There's a pent-up spiritual hunger.
Yes.
But we were not made to be alone. It's the first thing God said was for us to be left alone. So when that happens, after World War II, it wasn't about, I'm going to church to hear a great preacher. And if you think historically, I get so self-absorbed as a Westerner in my modern world that I forget the history of the church. Like, what was in the center of the church forever until about the 16 or 1700s? It wasn't the pulpit. That was never the center. It was the altar. And granted, we've got different views of communion or Eucharist or Lord's Supper or however you might say it. But I think the relational, sacramental, maybe not pure liturgical, I think that's where you're going to see a lot of communal gatherings about. It's not going to be data transfer at all. It's going to be and in those places where the altar is still in the middle, it's almost directly correlative that the sermon is shorter.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd challenge it another level and go, I think that if you look at the history of the church, the extended family unit, or the oikos, has always been the primary unit of mission.
Yes.
I mean, I'd go as far as to go, sometimes even the word we translate as church, or the Germans did as Kirche, the ecclesia, I go, this is the one where I'm working with a number of churches that are asking the question. Ecclesia at its best was the gathering of the elders of the city in the gate of the city, contending for the good of the city and its people.
Wow.
Yeah, that was an economic, social, spiritual, educational, family well-being. So
That's
in
good.
some ways, I think what we've done is we've retreated to our campuses and our sanctuaries, and we've asked people to come to us.
Wow.
So church has become a church-centric model of where things happen. Whereas Jesus only ever used that word twice, and he certainly didn't mean what we translate it as. He talked about the kingdom. So a kingdom mindset, for me, is one of those fundamental opportunities, because in the end, everyone is struggling with the new world. And where I believe spiritual leaders have an opportunity, if you gather the leaders of the spheres of culture and actually give them a vision for the transformation of your town or your city, where actually you begin to say to be a leader in education, health, government, business, is an equal kingdom calling as leading a church. You begin to mobilize far more people than perhaps the traditional church model can. So now, and that may be me being a little more radical, that may need another revolution. But when you begin to ask the question to go, every pastor I meet wants to mobilize God's people for works of service, for the works they were created for. But there is usually a centrifugal force which sucks resources to the center. And actually, you usually know if it works, because the pinnacle of Christian sacrifice is to become a pastor. Everyone wants to be on staff. That's a centrifugal force, whereas actually the centripetal force says, how do we actually send people out? And how do we actually begin to understand that in some ways, I say that a business is the most powerful vehicle for building extended family, because you are actually able to provide for their physical, material, spiritual. But a lot of people think that they have to become a pastor to function in what I would consider to be a much broader understanding of what does a leader of the kingdom look like who's leading an extended family. Anyway, you can play with that one. But do you want the last one? This is the one that's most relevant.
Sure.
With it. So the last one, this was 6 years ago, don't forget. We said the challenge of the new world was, how do I lead in a world which is digitally connected but geographically dispersed or remote? So we were finding that leaders were having to deal with, my people are not in the office with me. And I used to be able to apologize on Friday to take them all for lunch when I'd been a bit of a tyrant, but now they live on a screen somewhere and I only see them a few times a year. How do I do that? Well, most of the people watching here in terms of church, school, business, most are very used to a very high touch world. It's very local, it's very geographical. So they sometimes look at me when I used to put that one up and go, well, that's not really as relevant for me, Steve, as it is maybe for a business. Actually, they look at it now and go, we've now had to live in a world that has gone from high touch, no tech, to no touch, high tech in 3 weeks.
Wow.
So everyone is having this accelerated experience. And it's been fun. I don't know about you. I mean, I've loved watching. Churches have got better and better as the weeks have gone on. Now, some of them, like your Craig Rochelle's, and they've been doing this for years.
Yes.
But your average pastor in your average church of average size has suddenly had to go from a model they've known since they were this high to suddenly they're running Facebook Live or they're whatever they're doing.
Yes.
And it's just, the leadership of team gets more complex when you are remote. So here's what I say is, The skill sets you needed to lead in the new world were already a big enough challenge for most of us. But you throw in the remote component where we don't get as much FaceTime or touch time as we were used to. The skills of running a team in the virtual world are higher even than the ones they were face to face. So everyone's having a crash course, which is why everyone feels a little bit exhausted right now, because they're learning to orient a world which it won't last the way it is, but the skills we're learning, I believe, will be incredibly valuable, because I agree with you, is there is always, was it C.S. Lewis who said, he kind of whispers to us in our pleasures, he shouts to us in our pain.
Yes.
That we're all facing our mortality right now, and people are asking ultimate questions because they're almost being forced to slow down. There is only so much Netflix you can watch before you start to go bizarre. So people are asking deep philosophical questions, and they're interested in people who have engagement and worldview. And I said to class, I said, look, here's the thing. One pastor who's a good friend of mine in San Antonio, Texas, hated the idea of missing his 5 live preachers on a Saturday-Sunday combo until he realized 90,000 people had tuned in to watch him online. Suddenly realized there were more people who were prepared to engage with the truth of the scriptures online than there were even the 20,000 that would come on a Sunday, on a weekend.
Wow.
So all of a sudden there was this, oh my goodness, there are a lot of people who are hungry and interested and open and asking ultimate questions, who will not walk through the big doors of your sanctuary. But if you have an access point that is online and digital where they can begin the journey of engaging with your community, a lot more people are prepared to engage there where it feels safe, and it feels like they have the ability to switch you off if it's not going to work. The moment you've walked in, it's really hard to walk out until the end, and you don't really know where you're going. So that's another piece for me where I'm going. If the imagination, I would encourage teams when the time comes, even now, to ask the question, what would the new world look like if we were to take the primary calling of our vocation, so whether that's education, whether that's church or business, and ask the question, what would the best combination of tech and touch look like to deliver on what we believe that God has called us to be and do? And to ask the question, knowing that many of the younger people in your team will have a better answer than people who are 50 years old like me, because they're native to the new world. They've probably been trying to encourage us into this world for a period of time, and actually asking what's the best of what we want to keep, but what are the things that are new that allow us to do the thing which I believe every generation is called to do, which is to take the timeless truth of gospel, but to contextualize it and make it relevant and accessible for the people that you're seeking to serve. And I think there's an incredible opportunity. So I'm an optimist by nature, as I'm sure you imagine most entrepreneurs are. But I actually think that if people will grasp it and understand it and embrace their fear of the unknown and the uncertain, use team, they actually will come out of this with a model of sharing faith, Jesus, with people that is many, many years on from what it would have been if we'd not had the COVID experience.
That's very good. Such an encouraging word. And, don't ever waste a good crisis, right?
Absolutely.
So a lot of help for us today, Steve, as we turn our attention from dealing with a virus, which we still need to deal with, to how do we reopen things? How do we reopen the church? And what is it going to look like in the future? It's no longer hypothetical. It's real-time stuff. And I would encourage everybody listening today to go find the 5 Voices. We'll put a link in the show notes for sure. Steve, any final thoughts you'd share with everybody?
I think just to say that if what I've shared resonates in terms of some of the challenges of what leaders are facing, if I've been able in the slide to give you to go, that makes sense of why I've struggled. There are an awful lot of resources. We spent the last 6 years trying to go, how do we build tools for the new world? How do we build resources that leaders can actually use and play with? So I'll send you a link as well. But if you go to giant.tv/BB, that will give you a free month on really a platform which is trying to work out how do we retool leaders for the new world. There's plenty of Five Voices resources there as well, but that's probably the easiest place to access where we are at the moment. So giant.tv/BB, because we're realizing the new world needs a platform as well as for tech, as well as the touch of relational peace. But hope that's helpful, William.
Super helpful. And I'm kind of glad this recording got punted as many times as it did, because we wouldn't have had this rich conversation. No. So it's almost like someone else knows what they're doing and they're in charge.
Thank you. I've loved it. It's really nice
Best
to meet
you, and many wishes for another hole-in-one soon.
Thank you. Find it on Facebook, Steve Cockram. I've only ever had one. The fact it was a 30-yard pitch and putt in the back garden probably doesn't count. But all my friends at the golf club have been telling me I've still got to buy everyone a drink. So there we go.
Blessings to you, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, William.
That's going to be good.